U3 is about the history of movies, what we think of as cinema or motion pictures. Here's a quick summary. The Hollywood system dominated the early days of motion picture history. We'll go into that in a little bit more detail. Film technologies, the tools that filmmakers use to create movies, are constantly changing and have always constantly changed throughout the history of motion pictures. And finally, what we think of as modern cinema really rises after the widespread use of television. The way we think of movies today is a fairly new invention from the 60s and 70s, coming from competition with TV. Let's get into it. Starting at the beginning, film technology, or the projection of motion pictures, was invented in 1890 by a couple of different people, apparently simultaneously. And by 1910, the Hollywood system was already huge. People loved watching these new moving pictures, and the Hollywood industry came to dominate the motion picture world in a very big way. Here's a picture of a sign indicating that. See how the marquee of this theater is so prominent, so important, such a big deal. During those early days of the studio system, from around 1905 to the 1940s, when the studio system started losing some of its power, the studios were so big that it's hard for modern people to really imagine it. First of all, they made tons of money. There was lots and lots of power associated with producing motion pictures. And that wasn't just in theaters, though. It was also in the widespread culture and the society at large. You've got to understand that when movies were first prominent, they had no competition. There was no radio, there was no telephones, there was no television, certainly no internet or phones or anything like that. So movies were a huge cultural force. If you wanted to know what was going on in the world, your choice was to go to a live production, like let's say a play, or go to the movies. And that's what people did. They went to the movies. They were huge. Let's talk about some technology in the early days of film. Sound recording wasn't introduced to movies until 1927. Before that, all movies were silent. There might be a small band playing some music in the theater or some recorded music played alongside, but movies were intended to be silent, and audiences were quite used to silent films for decades. That was considered a very important part of films. Then The Jazz Singer was released in 1927, and that was the first talking movie, or talkie is what they came to be called, and people loved it. All of a sudden, all movie-going audiences wanted their movies to talk, and they wanted to hear the voices of actors. It really actually was quite a burden on the early cinema kinds of technologies, because microphones were very difficult to work with back then, and it changed the way movies were made for many years, trying to accommodate these new microphones. But of course, they eventually figured it out. In 1937, we're going to get full color. Movies had been colored before The Wizard of Oz, and I'll show you an example of that in the next unit, but The Wizard of Oz was the first full-color commercial film released in the United States, and it was a huge, exciting thing for audiences, but unlike sound, it was really decades before the majority of movies were released in color. Black and white continued to be a very powerful way to tell stories for until at least the mid-60s, and in fact it's still used today. There's commercials in black and white, TV shows, and movies, nowhere near as many as used to be. I think it was 1993 when the Academy Award for Best Picture went to Schindler's List, a black and white film. They are still made if you they're particularly good at creating a certain mood or a certain feeling or ambience. Moving on to more modern film technology, let's talk about aspect ratios. Aspect ratio, of course, is the ratio of the width to the height of the screen. And that's always changed. In the early days, aspect ratios were kind of squarish, and then today most televisions are a 16:9 aspect ratio, so we're used to that. But even in today's movie theaters, when you go to the theater, you can see a variety of aspect ratios projected up on that screen. They're always changing as new technologies are invented. Film stock itself. Now let's talk about film for a moment. Film, of course, is a chemically treated material that captures light. It's not digital. We modern young people who are going into the TV industry usually think of digital as being the way to capture video, but film predates digital by decades and decades, and film is a more accurate in a lot of ways. The technology of film stock has changed dozens of times. Today's Film stocks are much more subtle and can generate more gradients of color and can work in low light conditions even better, and that's always changed how movies can be made. Today we see a growing use of 3D in films. 3D technology is getting pretty big, and computer generated technology has been around with us for a while. Special effects have been generated by computers for decades, but today even some entire movies are made entirely inside of a computer program. All right, rewinding to the movies before television came out. So before television was widespread in the 1940s and 50s, a lot of movies were more episodic in nature. In other words, you'd go to the theater and see another episode of an ongoing show, a lot like television is today. You might also see news in the movie theater and cartoons. Remember, there was no other source for this information. So people would see news clips in the theaters between their shows, cartoons. Those Looney Tunes cartoons that you're so familiar with, those were originally created as fillers between movies in theaters. And remember, people went all the time. It was quite normal to go to the movies every week, or even more often than that. They were a huge part of culture. And then television comes along, and movies change and adapt. One way they changed was to become more spectacular, larger, more exciting, bigger budgets, a lot like the movies that we understand today, and unlike TV shows that they were trying to compete with. The MPAA announced its ratings system in 1968. Before that, movies were actually censored by the government. There was an office of the US government that told movies what was allowed and what wasn't. But after '68, the movies were allowed to regulate themselves with their rating system. And once you've got ratings like an R or a PG-13, that frees up movies to be more explicit or more violent or really more targeted at specific demographics. Before 1968, a movie had to be made for general audiences, and that didn't mean just kids. Adults were very much into the movies before the rating system. It's just that all movies tried to appeal to all people. Today's movies are much more specific, targeted at a particular group of people, like teenagers or older adults or children, for instance, and that's the movies that you're used to. And let's summarize. The Hollywood studio system dominated for the first several decades of the movie industry and were a huge cultural and economic force for the beginning. We still have these studios, by the way, their names are still out there. The film technologies, the tools that filmmakers use to make movies have always been changing constantly, and probably always will. And finally, modern movies, the way we understand movies today, really rises up after the competition with television comes along in the 1940s and 50s. And that summarizes U3a3 about the movies.